My name is Tammy Sufi. I'm a consultant with Toole Design, and we are multimodal planners and designers. We work all over the country. I'm based in our Kansas City office, and we were hired by the city to help with Complete Streets design guidelines and recommendations. So we're at the very beginning of the project, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about it. I did grow up in the Tulsa area, so even though I live in Kansas City, I'm pretty familiar with the area and excited to be part of this project. So really the goal of this project is to develop a plan that's going to guide improvements for the future, and really taking a look at both the ways that the streets can, of course, get people around, but also look at how the street can help support economic development and how it can be a way that the city develops kind of more of an identity and placemaking, so we can kind of use some of those visual aspects of the street to kind of develop some of that character of your community, much like you've already done in the Rose District. But really we're looking at supporting the adjacent land use with the street development, and then also making sure that we're looking at the needs of all the different users. We're looking at the safety of the street, the comfort, again, aesthetics, community identity. And this really comes out of the comprehensive plan that was passed a couple of years ago. There was a goal in there to create a connected, balanced, and sustainable multimodal transportation system. So this project's really kind of in the vein of that recommendation and trying to put some of that on the ground and work towards that goal. So I think for a lot of people, what does it mean, streets for all people? So I just wanted to define that. We're really looking at kind of like the process of developing streets, and anytime you go back and you repave or reconstruct a street, like just taking some time and using some additional design guidance that we'll be working on to really think about how you accommodate all different users of the street. So people who are driving, people who are walking, they might be biking, they might be in a wheelchair, looking at their needs, making sure that Broken Arrow streets are serving all ages and abilities. We're really looking at that entire right-of-way, so from property line to property line and what can be done in that space, and trying to be a little bit flexible and maybe not having every street look exactly the same, but trying to think a little bit about the land use context and making sure that the streets are accommodating those land uses. I think I've kind of already mentioned some of these different users of the streets, but again, trying to take a really broad definition of who needs to use city streets, not just motor vehicles, but also looking at pedestrians, other users. And a lot of people, when they hear about like balancing streets, they think, okay, well, are we going to put a bike lane on every street? And no, that's probably not going to be the solution for Broken Arrow streets, but we are going to think about who's using different streets. Is there a school on the street? Is there a library? What are the uses there? And who's going to need to get to those locations? And then trying to think about different ways that people can get to those locations. So again, trying to make sure that we're having a flexible approach to street design. And so when I talk about it, I kind of think about trying to transform streets from places that not always, but sometimes can be hostile environments for somebody who's not in a motor vehicle, and trying to transform those streets into the types of places that we know people really enjoy being. So places that feel safe and comfortable, where you have a mix of things that you can do, and they kind of support this vibrant activity that we like to see in our community. So really making sure that the streets are comfortable and inviting for all users of the street. So just to tell you a little bit about how we're going to do that, I know some of you were at our table earlier today, and we have some information on a survey and things that we've been working with working with the city to get that word out there. But we're working with a bunch of different folks on this. So we primarily want to hear from the public about what you want your streets to look like and how you want them to feel, how you want them to function. But we're also working really closely with a couple of committees. One is our stakeholder advisory committee, that was designated by council. And so we have met with that group once. We just started this project in mid-December. So we've met with that group once. We're also working with a staff technical committee. So we're also getting staff's perspective on the streets and how they can function and any constraints from the staff perspective. Ultimately, we're going to want to work with developers and other stakeholder groups. It's really important that we are thinking about maintenance and utilities and some of those different functions of the street and those different needs of the street. So we're working with those groups too. And with emergency services. Of course, we want the street to function well for emergency services as well. So we're engaging throughout this process, all those different groups. We'll be working on this project. Like I said, we started in December, and we're going to go for about a year to develop these design guidelines. And we're at the early stages of the project. So ultimately, we want to look at different opportunities for ways that we can integrate different things like sidewalks, bike paths, new crossings into street design. And we want to do it efficiently. We're going to need to balance the different needs of different users, but we also know that we want to build consensus throughout this project so that we're not having the same conversation over and over again about what different streets should be like, but we have kind of that high level vision and goals that the city's trying to achieve with the streets. So we'll be looking at some of those things throughout this project as well. And then I just wanted to mention some of the types of tools that ultimately we'll be using in these street design guidelines. And some of these things might be familiar to you, and I heard at the table some of these things that people were looking to see more of, things like sidewalks and crossings and things like that. So I'm just going to go through some of these. One of the things we'll be looking at is speed and safety on the city streets. We're looking at the crash history. And we know that there's a really strong relationship between how fast motor vehicles are going and how safe it is for somebody who gets hit by a motor vehicle, their likelihood of fatality or severe injury. So we're going to be looking in those areas where you might have more pedestrians and looking for the most appropriate speeds on those streets. We're also going to be looking at intersection design and looking at things like making some intersections more compact so that there's shorter crossing distances in places where you have a lot of pedestrian activity, and so that you really can increase that safety for all users. We'll be looking at things like crossing treatments. Are there opportunities for putting in medians or other refuges for pedestrians? Somebody talked to me today about their elderly mother who just really has a tough time getting enough time to cross the street. So there's a few different things we can look at, like lengthening the crossing time for pedestrians, but also sometimes putting in a median like that so that if you do get sort of stuck in the middle of the street, I think we've all had that happen, that there's a safer place for you to wait until the light changes again. So we're kind of looking at all these different types of things. Looking at creating some separation between motor vehicles and more vulnerable road users like pedestrians and bicyclists. And then just things like well-maintained sidewalks, making sure the sidewalks are wide enough, making sure that the requirements accommodate some sort of buffer between the curb and the sidewalk so that you have a little bit additional space between when you're walking and the motor vehicles. We're also looking at things like signals and lighting, so everything from just kind of your pedestrian or motor vehicle scale lighting on your streets. I heard a lot today at my table about needing more reflective paint and things like that on roadways, particularly for nighttime driving or when there's rainy conditions and things like that. So we'll be looking at some things like that, but also looking at signals for all users. And then also looking at some of the innovative treatments that are now out there, like lights that are just activated at certain times of day or just activated when there is a pedestrian that needs to cross but aren't activated at all times. So we're looking at some of those newer technologies. And then we're also looking at what we call placemaking, which is kind of a jargony term that I think planners and designers often use. But, really looking at the ways that you can use some of the space on the streets for those elements that might be unique to Broken Arrow. So you have down in the lower left, and sorry, I don't know why my picture covered up part of my words, but You have some gateway recommendations for making some of those entrances into Broken Arrow visually recognizable and interesting. So there's some things like that you can do. There's things you can do with signing, various treatments. So we'll be looking at some ways to do things like that. Also looking at just kind of the overall character. I think the Rose District is such a great example where you have street benches and street lights and banners and all these things that kind of make it feel like a distinct district. And there may be things that you want to do in other parts of the city that might be similar to that. Some of the questions that we have on our survey are about, do you want to see the same look all over town, or do you want to see different types of aesthetics and different types of treatments in different parts of town to give different neighborhoods different character? So we're interested in hearing in all of those different types of things from the public. And then also looking at things like where are opportunities to install additional street trees and landscaping, just for not only the visual appeal, but for things like shade and other reasons. And then I just wanted to mention that also part of our study, we'll be looking at ways to slowly implement these types of improvements. So this is not a street in Broken Arrow, but just as an example from another location. This was a street that was originally a 4-lane roadway, and the first improvement that was made between these two land uses on either side of the street was putting in a hawk signal, which is an activated signal when a pedestrian is there. So improving that crossing, that was kind of step one. And then step two was putting in some landscaping and putting in a separated bike lane. So this isn't necessarily the recommendation that we would make for Broken Arrow streets, but just to give you the example that, really we can look at ways of slowly implementing these types of improvement over time so they can be done in an economically kind of efficient and affordable way. So ultimately, we're going to produce a document, street design guidelines, and this is just kind of an overview of what would be in that document. Again, some of it's going to be really in the weeds in terms of design details, and we'll be working through a lot of those with our staff technical advisory committee. But really, I think what we're hoping to hear from the public, and I passed out some of these flyers with our QR code to our survey, but I'll make sure anybody who doesn't have one gets one of those. We'd really like to hear from the public just at that very high level. What are you looking to see on city streets? How do you want them to function? How do you want them to feel? Tell us about your current level of safety and comfort on city streets, and that'll really help us get all those details right in the design guidelines. So this is our schedule. Kind of winter and spring, we're doing that goal and vision establishment. We are reviewing things like your existing plans, some of your overlay districts. We're looking at things like crash data and traffic volumes. In the late spring and summer, we'll be starting to develop those design guidelines. We'll be developing some example concepts for a couple corridors throughout the city. And then in the fall, we expect to have our draft and final plan. And all of these deliverables throughout the project are going to be shared on the project website, and I'm going to mess it up. It's BA streetsforall.org, but it's on this sheet of paper, and I can make sure that you get it. You can also, I think we just went live with this site, but I think it's going to be linked from the city's site eventually as well. So that's a great place to go for updates on this project, to review our concepts, but also importantly right now to fill out the survey. It's going to be open for the next month and a half or so. So we would love to get your feedback on that. And that is